I'm Brittany DeTore. Today I'll be talking about the Beatles. I'm going to discuss the history of the band, the success they had in their careers, and the impact that they left on the music world. So the beginning was, I guess, July 1957. Paul McCartney went to see the Quarrymen in concert, which was John Lennon's band at the time. And he decided to go introduce himself to John Lennon, and John Lennon, after meeting him, decided, hey, do you want to join the band? And of course, Paul McCartney said yes. So at this point, they were touring. There were other people in the band, Stu, who was John's friend through college, and another friend of his, that I didn't write their names, but and they were touring in Germany and Hamburg. And they say now that they said this impacted their careers in interviews in the past. It shaped their careers, and it helped them to decide where they wanted to go with their music. A year after Paul joined the band, they were introduced to George Harrison, and they were blown away by his musicianship. They were just, because he was youngest person to join the band, but he was just an incredible guitarist. So they invited him to join the band, and he, of course, accepted. After they continued to tour Hamburg, Germany, and they were just doing small shows in like clubs, strip clubs, and bars. It was just very like low-end places, but they were getting their name out. And then things started to just happen in their lives. John's girlfriend got pregnant with his first son, Julian, so he had to return home to England. And then the other boys just kind of started partying, and they were deported and had to go home. But they still wanted to pursue music, so they continued in Liverpool, England, where they met Brian Epstein. And Brian Epstein came into the picture after seeing the band at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, and he just saw a lot of potential in the band. He was really blown away by their talent, and he wanted to pursue managing them, which he actually didn't become their manager officially until about a year and a half after meeting them. But even from the beginning, he was pushing their label or their records to labels and trying to get their name out there. At this point, the band had cycled through different members. They were changing up their names and their images. They, at this point, were George, John, Paul, and their drummer was Pete Best. And after lots of persistence in pushing their career, they were signed June 1962. And shortly after becoming signed, that was when they kind of booted Pete out of the band, and they asked Ringo Starr to be their drummer. So at that point, they were now working on their first album and their single. Their first single they released was called Love Me Do, and it reached number 17 on the charts in UK, which was pretty good. And their first album was Please Please Me. So that came out, they were getting their name out in the UK, and they were finding success. But they, when you make it big, you go to America. And Beatles weren't really being accepted by the US. They got really minimal airtime on like music television. They just weren't being taken seriously. US record labels were really skeptical of them. It wasn't until they released their second album called With the Beatles that they were taken seriously. They were the second album in the UK ever to sell 1 million copies. So after that, they were signed by Capitol Records, and they used their songs from Please Please Me, their first album they released in the UK. They took those songs and then they got the rights for them and re-released it on an album called Introducing the Beatles. On February 7th, 1964, that was when the Beatles arrived in America, and this is considered considered the British invasion. They appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was on CBS Networks, and that was like a huge thing with the publicity for the band. It was a really big variety show at the time. So they were special guests. They guest starred on 3 episodes, and it was viewed by 73 million people. And after this, Beatlemania, which is their fan base's name, was pretty much full blown.
You know, all of us on the show are darn sorry, sincerely sorry, that this is the 3rd and our last car show with the Beatles, because these youngsters from Liverpool, England, their conduct over here not only as fine professional singers, but as a group of fine youngsters who leave an imprint with everyone over here who's met them. And that goes for all of us on our side.
Definitely had some fangirls. At this point, after being on this show for 3 times, their families just skyrocketed. Their careers really started to take off in the US. They were just invited to perform in tons of different places. They were being interviewed by lots of different celebrity interviewers at that point, and they were offered their first movie deal, which their first movie was Help. The Beatles dominated the UK and US charts throughout their careers, along with having the top 5 positions on the Billboard Top 100 singles. They also held the top 2 positions on that chart. They had the number 1 position on the British singles chart, top 2 positions on the British albums charts, and number 1 on the British EP chart, all at the same time at one point in their career. They had 20 number 1 hits total on the US charts. They had numerous world tours. The song Let It Be, which was on their final album, won an Oscar for Best Original Song Score. They performed in very prestigious places like the Carnegie Hall. They starred in their own movies, cartoons, and documentaries. They had 13 albums total, which are displayed here. And this is just a brief overview of all of their accomplishments. Let It Be was their 13th album and their final album. They knew that they were going to separate at this point in their careers. It was released May 8th in 1970, which was a month after they had broken up. And at that point, ultimately, the band was just ready to split up and go separate ways. They started very young, and as you saw, they kind of were in a boy band stage. That was what they were selling. They had matching haircuts and suits, and as they got older, they wanted to pursue different styles of music, and different things were important to them. So the Beatles, they truly left their mark in the music world. To this day, they've sold over 1 billion records. They really changed recording, the styles of recording, and the different techniques you can use. They started using multiple tracks instead of playing live in studios. They recorded lyrics backwards in some of their songs. They varied the speeds of their tapes in order to get different pitch and speed of their voices. They were the first people to experiment and try different things with that. John Lennon and Paul McCartney are arguably the best songwriters of all time, and they were writing their own music. They were the 2 key writers. George and Ringo both wrote their own songs, but it was mainly Paul and John who wrote the majority of the Beatles singles, and it was in a time where it wasn't very popular to write your own songs. So they really, I think they inspired people now today. You know, there's lots of singer-songwriters. We can thank the Beatles for concerts. They were one of the first bands to sell out an arena with 55,000 people in the Shea Stadium in New York back in 1965. And they also were one of the first to perform the first ever global satellite TV broadcast back in 1967, where they performed All You Need Is Love. So the Beatles truly accomplished a lot. They accomplished more than most people accomplish in their whole lives, really, and they managed to do this in 7 years.